Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with the last part of your statement there. I hold both of our witnesses in the highest regard, and in the case of Secretary Panetta, I just whispered to my friend Senator McCain that two of my favorite Democrats in the House were Mineta and Panetta, and that has always been the case. And in fact, I rejoiced at the time that you received the positions and the appointments that you have had. It's long overdue that this committee is holding a hearing to examine the facts surrounding the terrorist attacks in Benghazi on September 11th of 2012. That left 4 Americans dead: Ambassador Chris Stevens, Sean Smith, Tyrone Woods, and Glenn Doherty. Deaths that I believe could have been prevented. What's become clear over the last 5 months is that the United States is woefully unprepared for what occurred in Benghazi. What has also been clear is that following the attack, the administration provided the American people inaccurate information about the true nature of the catastrophe and those events in Benghazi. It's in my discussions with the most senior administrative officials, I've been told that on the night of the tragedy, although there was confusion about the nature of the first attack on the compound where the ambassador was located, the second wave of attacks, which is on the annex, were unequivocally a terrorist attack. I have no doubt about that they were. This was apparent because of an angry mob doesn't use coordinated mortars and RPGs. So I have no question about that in my mind. Despite the clear evidence, it took this administration over a week to publicly admit, as many of us knew already, that it was a terrorist attack, not simply a protest that turned violent, as Ambassador Susan Rice adamantly and incorrectly insisted. While some may downplay the difference, I can't. Al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorists were involved in the murder of 4 Americans, including our United States ambassador to Libya. This fact should call into question the effectiveness of our counter-terrorism strategy to date in North Africa and beyond. I hope our hearing today will provide the committee with a thorough accounting of the facts leading up to the attack, as well as what has been done in months following to ensure that this tragedy doesn't happen again. In the months leading up to September 11th, there were no fewer than 4 significant attacks against the Western interests in the city. I'd like to have you go ahead and put that chart up there, and during this, leave it up during the course of this this hearing, because each member up here has a copy of this, and there are certain things that happened we all know. We know that on May 22nd, the Red Cross was hit with an RPG, and they left town. We know that on June 11th, the British ambassador's motorcade was attacked by an RPG. They left town. We know that on April 10th, the United Nations convoy was hit by an IED, and on June 6th, the U.S. consulate was attacked with a bomb, and many, many other things, but we stayed. We didn't leave. While I understand the State Department has a primary responsibility for the protection of American diplomats around the world, I also understand that the Defense Department plays an important role, supporting role to this effect. I expect our witnesses to explain today why, given the clear indicators and warnings that threats to the United States interests in Benghazi and throughout the North African were growing, was the Defense Department not placed on a heightened alert status or adequately postured to respond in a timely manner to a contingency of this nature, especially on the anniversary of 9/11. Our witnesses have repeatedly stated that there were no military assets available in the region that could have acted in time potentially to avert this disaster, and I have to ask, why not? And the January 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance directs that we will rebalance toward the Asian Pacific. It goes on to say that in Africa and Latin America, we will develop innovative, low-cost, and small-footprint approaches to achieve our security objectives. I don't agree. That's no way to achieve our security objectives. Benghazi highlights the strategic risks of this new strategy. In places like Africa, risks certain to be magnified by looming defense cuts. This committee must get a thorough accounting of exactly what was known and when, and what the Defense Department did to respond to the escalating situation in Benghazi and why it was not better prepared. Additionally, our witnesses should address whether or not the current relationship between the state and the Defense Departments is sufficient to meet the security demands of our overseas presence. You know, I've made over 100 African country visits. I know Africa. And what happened in Benghazi vividly illustrates what I've been talking about for a long period of time, that is the growing threat to the United States' interests on the African continent from the terrorist groups such as Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, and the Islamic Maghreb, and Boko Haram. General Ham, the commander of AFRICOM, who's been doing a great job with the limited resources, I must say, said back in 2011 that terrorist organizations in East Africa, in the deserts of northern Africa and Nigeria, quote, have little explicitity and publicity voiced intent to target Westerners and the U.S. specifically. Secretary Panetta, the same year, you said, quote, the longer you delay, the longer you avoid trying to assign some assistance there, the more dangerous these groups have become and the greater the instability that develops here. There are elements there in Central Africa that either have ties to Al-Qaeda or that present the forces of terrorism in their own. And that's what's dangerous. As bad as everything that I've stated is, what I think is worse is the cover-up. It was obvious from the information we had on September 11th that the second wave, not the first wave, the second wave, we have two different waves there. We had the compound, which we'll talk about in more detail during the questions, and then we had the annex. But that the second wave of attacks on the annex were unequivocally a terrorist attack, and we knew it right at the time. Despite this information, Ambassador Rice said something that was totally false to the American people on all 5 major Sunday news shows, implying that the attacks were response to an anti-Islam video that spurred protests across the region. In this sense, you are probably wrong, the wrong witness to have here, because you'd be unfamiliar with who actually instructed her to say that and gave her that faulty information. But that's something we hope that we'll be able to get, and that's something that can't be ignored. When you sit around all day long and talk about the resources that we should have and don't have, not just here, not just in this part of the world, but all over the world, and that's fine, and I think we all understand that. But that's not the big problem here, and the big problem here is the cover-up, and nobody talks about it, and that's the tragedy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.